Welcome, and thank you for joining today's Distinguished Speakers Series at Bakersfield College, hosted by the Bakersfield College Student Government Association, BCSGA, and the Office of Student Life in collaboration with the Veterans Resource Center at Bakersfield College. The Distinguished Speakers Series at Bakersfield College is hosted by the Student Government and the Office of Student Life. These webinars and many other student-centered events are made only possible by the BCSGA KVC Student Services Sticker Program, which students have the option to purchase at the time of registration. For more information, visit bakersfieldcollege.edu/BCSGA. Closed captioning is available by clicking the closed caption button at the lower part of your screen. This is a webinar event, thus you will not be able to show your video or talk through your mic. You can pose questions. In the lower part of the screen, you will see a Q&A button. Press this to submit your questions to us. We will review the questions and ask them at the end of the speaker's presentation. We may either respond to the question live or respond to it via the module. The Distinguished Speaker Series brings community leaders from around the world to Bakersfield College whose achievements have had national and/or international significance. Each speaker was proposed by BCSGA by either a department or a faculty member. Collaboration between many entities on campus make these events successful each year. The events are free and open to the public. All events this year are held on a Zoom webinar platform. For more information for future speakers, please visit bakersfieldcollege.edu/student-events/SDSS. Please note today's webinar is recorded. In case of technical issues, please stay online as we work through them. In the case of disconnection, please join us on Facebook Live at facebook.com/SGABC. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the Q&A module so the moderator will be able to respond or ask live at the end of the speaker's presentation. As a reminder, we have other presentations on future days. Without further ado, I welcome Ms. Jenny Frank, Manager for Veteran Services at Bakersfield College, to introduce today's distinguished speaker.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jenny Frank, and I'm a Marine Corps veteran. Also, I'm the Manager of Veteran Services and Programs here at Bakersfield College. Through our Veterans Resource Center, we assist veterans and military-connected students through their educational journey. Tomorrow is Veterans Day, and typically Bakersfield College has a host of celebratory events on campus. This year with COVID, we will still be celebrating, though virtual. Today is our kickoff event. Tomorrow we will be releasing a veteran resource video to help veterans and dependents navigate local benefits. On November 18th, we will be holding a private virtual 30-unit coining ceremony to acknowledge our veteran students who have achieved 30 units. Our final event is on November 23rd and 24th with the distribution of success packs to new and continuing veteran students at the Student Life Building between 10 and 3. Assisting us today is Mr. Paul Beckworth. Paul is a veteran of the United States Navy. He is our faculty coordinator for this presentation and a professor of history, and a major driving force behind the development of veterans resources and the Veteran Resource Center here at Bakersfield College. Last but certainly not least, we have our distinguished speaker, Mr. David French. David French is a senior editor at the Dispatch and a columnist for Time. A graduate of Harvard Law School and a constitutional lawyer, David most recently worked as a senior writer for the National Review and as a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. He is a New York Times bestselling author, and his book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation, is the topic of our discussion today. David is a former major in the United States Army Reserve. In 2007, he deployed to Iraq with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment and was awarded the Bronze Star. I'd like to thank you, sir, for your service and wish you a happy Veterans Day. With that, I will turn it over to you to talk about your book and what concerns and hopes you have for the future of our country.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. I said this on the first edition. I feel a little self-conscious at a distinguished speaker series when I'm broadcasting from my podcasting lair, which features my alternative life as a wannabe sports podcaster behind me, but we'll forge ahead anyway. Ignore the Southeastern Conference expressions of dominance behind me, and let's just focus down on the state of our country and why I am worried about where we are headed, and worried to an extent that I would write a book that actually used the S word, secession. And no, I'm not saying that America's going to split apart right now, although there was a Mississippi state legislator who today said Mississippi should leave the country because of Joe Biden, which is just unbelievable. No, I'm not saying the country is going to split apart right now. I'm not saying this country is going to split apart in the near future. But what I am saying is that we can't keep doing what we're doing with and not expect over the long term to have serious and possibly catastrophic consequences. And what do I mean? What do I mean? So I basically begin the book with a statement that says that America's continued unity cannot be guaranteed, and that there is no truly important cultural, social, or religious force, or political force for that matter, that is pulling Americans together more than it's pushing us apart. And the way in which I came to this conclusion, and the way in which I began to understand what's actually happening now, is actually came about in part through my deployment. I deployed to Iraq in October 07. October 31st, 07 is when I left my house. Came back in late September of 2008. And in between that time, I served with the 2nd Squadron, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Diyala Province, Iraq, during the surge. And it really altered my perspective. Before I served in Iraq, I was a civil liberties lawyer. I was the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. I defended the rights of all people who had their rights under threat, left, right, faith, religious, not religious. It didn't matter. Didn't matter your identity. It just mattered whether your civil liberties were violated. And I defended your civil liberties no matter what. But I was also pretty partisan. I was a pretty partisan guy. I was a pretty partisan Republican. Wasn't mad about it. Wasn't one of these people who fears and despises people on the left. But I was pretty partisan. So partisan that I even once said some words at a speech that I really, really regretted. And I came to regret pretty soon after I said the words. And here's what happened. I was speaking at a conservative conference out in California, San Bernardino, I believe. Yes. Yeah. San Bernardino. And I was asked a question. It was right before my deployment. And the question was, why are you going to deploy when you already have a very, what they were calling an important law practice here in the United States? So I gave the story of my decision to join the military. I joined late in life. I went to officer basic training when I was 37. In the first segment, I told that story. I won't tell that story this time, but I joined when I was late in life at age 37. Finished my initial training when I was 38 and was set to deploy when I was 38 years old. And so they're asking me, why would I do that? And here's the answer that I gave. And the answer was, I believe the two great threats to America are radical jihadists at home. I mean, radical jihadists abroad and radical leftists at home. And the crowd cheered. They agreed with me. It's kind of crowd-pleasing kind of reaction that you give, or crowd-pleasing kind of answer you give in highly partisan environments. And then I went to Iraq and I saw what an actual enemy was. We fought Al-Qaeda in Iraq. We fought, really they were the precursor to ISIS. They had already begun to transition their name away from Al-Qaeda in Iraq to the Islamic Caliphate of Iraq. And all of the atrocities, if you remember the height of ISIS in 2014, 2015, all of the atrocities that made international headlines, we encountered all of that. Decapitations, brutal murders, burning people alive. It's horrible. And I realized that is an enemy. my friends on the left at home, that is not an enemy. That's a political opponent. That's a somebody I will vigorously contest and in arguments over ideology or law. But why would we keep using that kind of language? Why is that kind of language so common? And why would I use it? When you put on the uniform of your country, you're saying I'm not wanting to, but you're willing to lay down your life, not just for your friends, not just for Republicans if you're a Republican, or Democrats if you're a Democrat, but for all Americans. And so I felt shame about what I said. I felt shame about it because I realized that I need to be more precise in my language. I need to be more understanding and have greater perception of who we really are and what we really have in common. And this was something that I was beginning to departisan myself. Why would I think that the people that I was willing to lay down my life for, or risk my life for, why would I think that they were my enemies? If I'm willing to risk my life for them, they're not my enemies. We're going to disagree, but they're not my enemies. And the funny thing is I was beginning to sort of have this epiphany that I needed to depolarize myself. I was coming back home to a country that was repolarizing, or its polarization was deepening. By every measure, when I came home, Americans disliked each other more. By every measure, when I came home, Americans were more distrustful of institutions. When I came home is when, and I was present at the creation, kind of present at the creation of the birther movement. I was working for a religious liberty law firm at the time, and I got an email, a very urgent email that said, join this conference call. The fate of the nation may be at stake. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I really dislike conference calls. I really dislike conference calls. They're not my favorite. But hey, look, if a conference call says the fate of the nation's at stake, I'm not going to miss something about the fate of the nation because there's a conference call. And in fact, some of the people who were going to be on that call were individuals that I knew and respected, some of the top conservative lawyers in the United States. So I pick up the phone, I dial in, and I hear that the topic of the call is a lawsuit that's about to be filed trying to declare President Obama ineligible for the presidency because he's not born in the United States. And I immediately hung up the phone. Thought, what? Who believes that? That's strange. Then I came to see that, in fact, millions of people believed it. Millions of people. And then I saw that it was being years later, I saw that it was being pushed, particularly by a reality TV star and a real estate developer. You know him as Donald Trump. And I thought, well, that's strange. Why would he be pushing that? And by the way, who listens to him anyway? He became president of the United States. And so all of my senses around me began to show me and tell me that we were increasingly distrustful. We disliked each other to an increasing degree, animosity increasing. And it was increasing in a particular kind of way. One of the things that I noticed when I was in Iraq is that Sunni and Shia, and I talked to Sunnis, I talked to Shia, I talked to police officers, I talked to military officers, I talked to tribal leaders. And one of the things I noticed was that they weren't actually shooting each other over policy differences. I mean, they had policy differences. They didn't want, representation in parliament was a policy difference. Division of oil revenues was a policy difference. And they mattered and they cared about them. They weren't even shooting each other really over theology. I was kind of skeptical after, talking to some folks, how much they could even explain all the theological differences between the Sunni and Shia brands of Islam. What they were shooting each other was over grievances. And the grievances were very real. A Sunni person might say, well, the Shia killed my nephew, or a Shia person might say the Sunni killed my uncle. And there was a necessity of revenge. There was a necessity of self-defense. There was just a sense of grievance, of overriding grievance. And what I began to notice in our own divisions here in the United States was, yeah, we have policy differences. We have policy differences. We really do. Policy differences don't tend to result in very much dramatic change because our country is really closely divided and it's very hard for one party to hold power for any length of time. So even as policy differences increase, the sense of frustration that we can't actually do anything that we want to do, or that any winning side wants to do, increases as well. But it wasn't over policy differences. I began to see that people were nursing grievances, thankfully not grievances to the same extent that we saw in Iraq, but each side had a narrative. If you talk to a conservative, they're going to say, look, Donald Trump may not have been my first choice, but look what they did to Kavanaugh. Look what they did to the Covington Catholic kids. Look at cancel culture. Look at Antifa. Look at the looting and the violence over the summer. And there's this list of things, and many of them actually have occurred. They actually happened. Somebody was mistreated, or there was actual looting, or there was actual violence. And that is seen as the justification for the ramping up of tensions. And then you talk to somebody on the left and you say, well, look at the the family separation policy. Look at the Proud Boys. Look at the alt-right. Look at the incredible rhetoric that you're seeing. Look at the, and you go down the line and you see, and you see violence. Look at the attacks on a synagogue in Pittsburgh, attacks on a synagogue in California, attacks on a Walmart in El Paso, church shooting in Charleston, that these radical far-right people are creating violence. And you begin to have this narrative of competing stories based on real things that occurred that are above and beyond the policy differences that begin to drive us apart and pull us apart. So we're in the grips of increasing animosity. We're in the grips of competing narratives that tell us that we dislike each other. But there's more than that going on as well. And in my book, I talk about 3 big concepts that make everything worse. They just make everything worse. And I'll just walk through them one by one, talk about our solutions, and then let's have some time for questions. So, number 1, what is one of the really big things tearing us apart? It's called the big sort. The big sort. This is something, I didn't come up with it. It came from 2009 book by a guy named Bill Bishop, very smart book. And what he was basically saying is we're clustering into like-minded enclaves. We are moving and living around people who agree with us. We're less likely to live around people who disagree with us. And this is something he wrote about in 2009, and it's just kept going and going to the point where in 2016, more Americans lived in what are called landslide counties, or one side or the other wins an election by 20 points or more than any time since we've been measuring the statistics. So we're living around people of like mind. It may not be the case here with the people who are listening in right now. It may not be the case at all. You may have a really diverse friend group. But if you do, you're kind of in the minority in the US. Increasingly, we're around people who agree with us. We have friends who share our values. We have friends who share our political values, friends who share our religious values. And so what's happening is we're kind of walling off into our own like-minded enclaves. And some of them are even becoming like super clusters. Let's take some on the right and some on the left. On the right, for example, about 80% of white evangelicals vote for Republicans, about 80%. That's an overwhelming number, an absolutely overwhelming number. That means if you go to, for example, a mainly white evangelical church, there's about an 80% chance that the person you're talking to shares your point of view politically. That means there's a lot of groupthink. So what about on the left? Well, on the left, there are entire cities. Like the island of Manhattan is around 85% Democrat. The city of Washington, D.C. is more than 90%. Center City, Philadelphia, more than 80%. San Francisco, more than 80%. And the list goes on. Huge cities, overwhelmingly Democratic. And so what ends up happening is you spend a lot of time with people who are like yourself. So we're clustering. We're walling off from each other. Now, does that have an effect of any kind? Yeah, absolutely. one of the effects that it has is that it makes us more extreme. It makes us increasingly drawn to extremism. How is that possible? Well, there's this concept. So concept number one is called the big sort. Concept number two is called the law of group polarization. So what is the law of group polarization? The law of group polarization basically means when people of like mind gather, they get more extreme. You can see this in your daily life all the time. So let's suppose you're all getting together and you're part of a political group and you all agree that there should be more gun control or that there should be less gun control. Well, by the time you finish talking, are you more convinced of your position or less convinced of your position? Usually you're more convinced. If there's no one there who disagrees with you, you're almost always more convinced. And what Sunstein found is that when people of like mind gather, sometimes they'll end up their discussion more extreme than the most extreme person was at the start of the conversation. In other words, it has a cascading effect that we get more extreme faster. Well, what's happening then? If you have a group of people here in one part of the country who are absolutely definitely of like mind, and a group of people here in another part of the country who are of like mind, they're going to start to separate in their views of the world. They're starting to pull apart in their views of the world. And we see this in American politics. It used to be that we had sort of a bell curve where most everybody was in this sort of big middle, and you just had a few people at the extremes. But what we've seen in the last decade and more is that bell curve is flattening. Both sides are heading towards the extreme. Not always at the same time, not always at the same pace, but both sides are heading to the extreme. And so ideas that were once quite unusual, quite fringe, are now quite mainstream on the right and on the left. So we're living apart, we're getting more extreme. And then this gets us to the third. We've had point number one is the big sort. Point number two is the law of group polarization. Point number three is the Overton window. What is the Overton window? The Overton window is the range of acceptable communication. So basically think of it like this. It is the speech that you can engage in without getting canceled. Now, what is the Overton window? Well, does it change? Yeah. Sometimes it changes for the better. So for example, 60 years ago in American politics, a person could engage in blatantly racist speech without repercussion. Well, the Overton window has moved where that's not okay anymore. And that's good. That's good. There are changes to American public discourse that are good. And so when I say that the Overton window can move and shift and some speech can be socially unacceptable, I'm not saying that's always bad. Sometimes it's good. However, what's ending up happening is that the Overton window, we're not just have one Overton window. We're beginning to split apart. So we have two Overton windows, one often for the right and one often for the left, depending on the topic. I'll give you a good example of an issue where there's often two Overton windows. Gun rights. If you're in a very, very deep blue area, the idea that you would argue for something like constitutional carry, which is a legal doctrine that says I don't need a gun permit to carry a gun outside the home. The Constitution is my gun permit. As long as I can legally own one, I can carry it outside the home. Advocating for constitutional carry in some social circles in the US you'll be labeled a weirdo and a crank. Who are you? What is your problem? It will be a social issue for you, not an ideological issue or an intellectual issue. It will be a social issue for you because you're so outside the mainstream. But then in other areas, if you don't believe in constitutional carry, then it's what's wrong with you? Are you a gun grabber? Why would you limit my Second Amendment right? I was talking to a Tennessee gubernatorial candidate a couple of years ago, asked him, what's the most common question that you've gotten so far on the trail? It was early in the process. And he said, most common question is, why isn't Tennessee a constitutional carry state yet? And so you'll have these competing worldviews, and maybe constitutional carry opposing it wouldn't get you tossed out of polite society and in gun rights circles, but advocating an assault weapons ban would be a social problem, or limitations on large capacity magazines, that'd be a social problem. And so you begin having this issue where even beginning to try to engage in discussion outside the paradigm of your group that could link you in some way to a real conversation with somebody in the other group creates a social problem for you, where you have to count the cost of your friendships, of your relationships, of maybe even your business relationships. And so this is what Overton windows do. So you're clustered amongst people of like mind, you're getting more extreme, and you're getting less capable of speaking to other people. Now, it would be one thing if we were sort of growing apart, but amicably, like, oh, look at those quirky guys out in California. You guys are, I like you, kind of like I like Canadians. And Californians looking at somebody like me, oh, you're in Tennessee. You say y'all a lot. You drink bourbon and listen to country music. It's all good. We're all fine. Excuse me. Scratchy throat. And it would be one thing if we saw this as quirky, if we saw this as, well, sort of to each his own. But what we have is an increasingly powerful federal government governing over an increasingly diverse American population. And so this sort of idea that Tennessee can be Tennessee and California can be California, and we can sort of celebrate our differences while not imposing our vision for the world on each other, is increasingly receding. And so we don't see these differences as sort of benign diversity, or even maybe even beneficial diversity. What we see them as is a political threat. We see them as and sometimes even an existential threat to our way of life or to our beliefs. And that's why, as America grows more apart geographically, grows more apart ideologically, is less capable of talking to each other, animosity is skyrocketing. I mean, we see this from the evidence of our senses, our eyes, our ears. If you spend any time on Twitter, you know that it is a cesspool of rage and anger. We see it on Facebook, not as much maybe sort of on Instagram, but you see it on all kinds of social media platforms: rage, anger, fury. We see it increasingly leaking into real life. And we see it leaking into family relationships. There's deep animosity, but the evidence, the testimony of our eyes and ears is supplemented by social science data. And that social science data tells us that if you're a Republican, you're going to, more than 80% of you are going to ascribe terrible values to Democrats. And if you're a Democrat, more than 80% of you are going to ascribe terrible values to Republicans. And the more engaged in politics you are, the worse it is. And what makes it worse is you're often wrong. You're often wrong because we sort of silo into our individual social media bubbles or our individual news bubbles. We're constantly being fed stories about how weird and awful and terrible and extremist our political opponents are, to the point where a group called the More in Common Project surveyed politically engaged Americans and found that if you were someone who watched a lot of television, who read a lot of political media, you were more wrong about your political opponents than those people who barely engaged at all. Why? Because you were being manipulated in many ways, or you're allowing yourself to be manipulated by partisan press, and that was exaggerating the threat of your opponents. Whereas those other people who are not in the media every day, those people were getting their knowledge about their political opponents by things called friendships or relationships. So they actually knew people and knew where their heart was, what they really believed. So my book posits, and I looked at the two sort of really very real secession movements in American history, the 1776 secession from the British Empire and the 1860-1861 secession from the Union. And there are things that are disturbingly in common right now in the United States. One We're in geographically connected enclaves. The entire Pacific coast is very, very blue. The entire Northeast is very, very blue. The Southeast, by and large, is very, very red. Much of the Midwest is very, very red. So these big geographic enclaves that are deep blue or deep red that have a common culture and that feels that their culture is under attack, that their culture is under threat. Now, it's not as much of an emergency as it was in 1776 when the colonists thought not just their liberty, but their very lives were under threat because, especially in the Boston area, British regulars were actually there on the ground, boots on the ground. Or not like 1860 or 1861, where Southerners not only were trying to preserve slavery and trying to defend the evil of slavery, they also believed that their lives were under threat. They thought that Northern abolitionists were trying to incite a slave rebellion that would be deadly to thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Southern citizens. And so in the seminal one-volume history of the Civil War by McPherson called Battle Cry of Freedom, it talked about how the partisan press in the South whipped Southerners into what it called unreasoning fury. These were the conspiracy theorists of the day. This was the fake news of the day. And it was winning over the hearts and minds of Southerners, making them believe that Northerners didn't just want to end slavery, the Northerners wanted them dead. And so if you read the secession documents from 1861, they'll include conspiracy theories. Like this Texas secession document actually includes the allegation that Northerners were trying to poison people of the South. Thankfully, we're not there yet. We don't have that degree of paranoia, but we do have these geographically distinct, culturally distinct American enclaves that believe that they're under threat. And that's a very negative development. So what do we do about it? What do we do? Well, I just think it's naive to say at some point we're all, maybe a love will break out. That's a hope. That's not a plan. Maybe we'll, suddenly the scales will fall from our eyes and we'll suddenly see the humanity of our opponents. That's a hope. That's not a plan. We don't enjoy a common pop culture. I mean, we can't count on like TV shows bringing us together because we don't watch the same stuff. And even what we watch is divided by red and blue often. But what can we do? Well, there's a couple of things that we can do. One starts here with a person, and the other one's policy. So let's talk personal, then we'll talk policy, and we'll take questions. So first is the personal. I'm not naive. I know that we're not all one day going to start loving each other. I know that that's unrealistic. The differences are great. People we disagree, they're too annoying. We're not all going to start loving each other. But we can at least begin to tolerate each other as tolerance is properly understood. And tolerance doesn't mean love. Tolerance doesn't even mean affection. Doesn't mean love, doesn't mean affection. There's a writer who writes under the pseudonym Scott Alexander, and he talks about how he challenges some of his left-leaning audiences to be more tolerant. And he'll talk to him and he'll say, "Are you guys tolerant?" And they'll say, "Yeah, absolutely, we're tolerant. We love people regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity. We're tolerant." And he goes, "Well, wait a minute. What's wrong with those people then?" And he said, "What do you mean what's wrong with them? Nothing's wrong with them." And he responds, "Well, what are you tolerating then?" Tolerance presumes that there is something to tolerate. Tolerance presumes that there is something that is annoying or that bothers you or that maybe even offends you about another person. But what tolerance does is tolerance says, even if I disagree with you profoundly, I believe you have a home in this country. There's a beautiful expression of this notion from actually Lin-Manuel Miranda quoting George Washington, quoting the Bible. And it comes from a verse in the Bible that George Washington wrote about 50 times, that he referred to almost 50 times in his writing. It's repeated in the Hamilton musical, and it's really a beautiful sentiment of pluralism, of what it means to live together and to provide each person their own home and place in this country. And most famously, he wrote this verse when he wrote the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island, to tell, this most viciously persecuted religious minority that they have a home in this land, that they have a place in this land. And the verse comes from Micah, the book of Micah, chapter 4, verse 4. And it's, every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. It's a beautiful verse. It's a beautiful sentiment. And what it basically says is, you have a home. He was telling the Hebrew congregation, you have a home. Now, we all know history. We all know that aspiration for America was not fulfilled at our founding. We all know that the ideals of the Declaration of Independence were not fulfilled in our founding. But those ideas, like George Washington spread, the ideas of the Declaration of Independence, the legal doctrines of the Bill of Rights, were set at tension with the intolerance of the day and the oppression of the day. And slowly, and sometimes bloodily, the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, the ideals of that sentiment from the book of Micah, the legal doctrines of the Constitution began to cover more and more and more people. And so having tolerance, being able to say to another person, even if I profoundly disagree with you, that every man, every person shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. That's got real power to it. And at the heart level, as a heart desire for our fellow citizens. What does that look like from a policy standpoint? Well, one thing it looks like is a reinvigorated Bill of Rights. Every time America has really broken its promise to some segment of its population, it has always broken its promise in part by breaking its promises in the Bill of Rights, by depriving some of its citizens of free speech, by depriving some of its citizens of due process, by depriving some of its citizens of their lives without due process. The list can go on. And so it requires a commitment to the Bill of Rights, but it also requires something else. It requires a commitment to pluralism itself. James Madison in Federalist number 10, which is my favorite Federalist paper, it should be your favorite Federalist paper, talks about how the Founding Fathers wrestled with the problem of faction, of the violence of faction. And you say, what? Why would y'all wrestle with faction? Weren't you all a bunch of white, mostly Christian males, kind of all cookie cutter the same? No. In fact, these were people, they were white, they were mostly Christian, but they were coming from competing religious traditions that had just fought the wars of religion. And for those who don't know, the wars of religion were a series of wars that swept the European continent in the 17th century, and they were devastating. They were more devastating than any other military conflict until the world wars hit Europe. Maybe perhaps some of the Napoleonic conflicts were close, but they were devastating. And so when you have a new nation that is made up of many of the theological combatants of the wars of religion, you're really worried and thinking about how can we stay together? And what James Madison said is one of the ways that we stay together is by allowing many factions to flourish. And as many factions flourish, no one faction can choke out the others, but it does this very powerful thing. It creates a home. It's an early explanation of pluralism within the American Republic. And it's vital to our understanding of the path forward, just vital. And so how can we achieve that pluralism today? Well, one way we can achieve it is through the principle of federalism or localism. And this is a principle that says that as many authorities and responsibilities as possible shall be pushed as close to the people as we can realistically. Now, of course, you have to have a national defense strategy. You can't push national defense down to the state and local government level, but to the extent you can push an issue down to the state and local level, what that will do is it'll allow each of our different societies, each of our different political communities and cultural communities to begin to shape their polity, to begin to shape their city, their region, their state in a manner that's consistent with their values. In other words, you let Tennessee be Tennessee, you let California be California. increase that sense of self-governance, increase that sense that, yeah, I can participate in a political process where what I want can occur. Well, in other words, what I want, I can through political activism and the quest for change the conditions of my life and the life of the people around me. That's incredibly empowering. But that's kind of not what we have now. I live in a very red state. I've lived in very blue states and very red states. And what that means is I've never cast a meaningful vote for president in my life. The most powerful man of the most powerful country in a constitutional republic, and I have not been able to cast a vote for him. That meant anything. That's deeply alienating. That's deeply frustrating. And so that means, when we have this incredibly powerful federal government with the executive branch, contrary to the intent of the founders, the most powerful branch of that government, it's alienating, it's frustrating. Whereas our states, there's enormous capacity within our states, economic capacity, cultural capacity, social capital, to make changes, to do things that reflect the will and the values of the citizens of those states. And so what I think is a political solution to this, a political solution, not the political solution, is greater autonomy, greater ability to govern yourselves. So it requires a heart change. It requires a policy change. Also requires, to be honest, a character change. We have not been led by the greatest class of politicians in American history. And look, honestly, that's on us. We haven't demanded it. We have this need for politicians who try to govern through, not by just whipping up their base and enraging their base against the opposition, but by reaching across the aisle, trying to reach a level of consensus and compromise on critical issues. We have a need for that. We have a need for statesmen. And to be honest, they're thin on the ground. And one of the reasons why they're thin on the ground is, while there might be a demand for statesmen, why might be a need for statesmen, there's not been a demand. Time and time again, American voters choose leaders who are more focused on punching the opposition in the nose than in trying to work with the opposition as fellow citizens. So that's the broad brush. That's where we are. We have, through the big sort, group polarization, the Overton window, we have created a culture where we're deeply divided, full of animosity for each other, and have an inability to communicate. What can we do about it? We can start to tolerate. We can re-embrace pluralism as a concept, as a value, and we can try to give individuals more control over their lives. With that, thanks a lot. I really would appreciate your questions. I had some great questions last sessions.
So first question, Mr. French, do you believe that social media makes the divisions worse between opposing sides, or would the trend to more extreme divisions are simply inevitable regardless of the social media phenomena?
So first, social media has a role, but we shouldn't overinterpret it. It's funny, that was one of the first questions last session. It's probably a question I get as much or more than any other question. And number one, we're dividing before social media. The group polarization was occurring before social media. In fact, the law of group polarization paper was written in 1999, well before social media. So we were big sorting before social media. I mean, 2009 was when Bishop wrote his book. And I think the iPhone was, 08, 09 era. Then Facebook app starts taking off in the early 2010s. So we were on our way to polarization before social media, but there are ways in which social media obviously makes it worse. Our ability to silo off into like-minded enclaves online, the way in which we remove ourselves from human contact, especially in services that allow that sort of anonymous interaction like Twitter. I mean, the discourse on Twitter is worse than any discourse I've ever participated in in an in-person basis. And I've been in quite a few heated in-person confrontations in my life, but nothing like just constant, vile personal insults that you see and read on Twitter. So yeah, and social media definitely plays a role. It allows misinformation to spread virally, but it's not all bad. I mean, it also grants us enormous access to virtuous speech and to good people. It can be used as a tool to combat misinformation. I mean, it's a tool, and like many tools, it has, it's like a two-edged sword. It has a negative and it has a positive side. And right now, I would say in particular, the social media world of politics is mainly negative. In other cultural contexts, social media is not as negative. I'm a huge NBA basketball fan, and one of the delights of life is in NBA Twitter. Or when I'm engaged in conversation about pop culture, like I have a whole other political pundit life over the superiority of DC over Marvel or the problems with the prequels. And that's a delightful conversation and brings together a whole lot of interesting people until people find out that I'll respond to replies when I tweet about pop culture, and then the political haters will sneak in and hurl insults. But so social media is not all bad. The problem is it puts human nature on blast. And with so many of these things, a lot of the problem lies here with us, and we look to blame external forces for problems that are really our own.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What is the role of communities of faith in making social divisions smaller?
Great question. You can equally ask, what is the role of communities of faith in making social divisions larger? It's funny. I was in a conversation with Rabbi Jonathan Sachs shortly before he passed away, and some other faith leaders. And this was a couple of months ago. And the topic was religion necessary for a thriving democracy? Is religion necessary for a healthy democracy? And I said, well, it depends on what kind of religion. And I don't mean Christianity versus Islam, but I mean, I have seen elements of Christianity that are incredibly intolerant and divisive. And I've seen people who are Christians who are some of the most open-hearted, magnificent, phenomenal, indispensable people you'll ever meet. And the way I put it is I believe that morality is necessary in making social division smaller. I draw a lot of, and I often refer back to another verse from Micah, one that's often forgotten, sadly, by Christians who engage in the public square. And that verse is this: what does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? It is to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before the Lord your God. Those are three interlocking obligations. And often we'll try to act justly. We'll try to seek the right thing, do this or do that for the good of America, for the good of my state, for the good of my party. And we'll often forget the obligation to love mercy, or in other translations will say love kindness. And then because we get so convinced that we're right, we lack any humility at all. And I think that's a huge problem in our social divisions, is the absolute lack of humility. We look at these huge problems that we have. Let's take race, for example. Is there anything more complicated in our public life than trying to figure out how to undo all of the ways in which 345 years of slavery and Jim Crow together have twisted and distorted our American culture? That is complicated. That's complicated. And yet people walk in as if they've got this whole thing figured out. And not only are you right, but there's something wrong with you if you don't agree with everything. And that's how people who agree with each other about trying to deal with the effects of racism can find themselves hating each other. And so we end up with this culture right now where you can meet somebody and you can agree on 70% of all the important things in life, but missing that last 30% makes you a 100% enemy. because we don't have humility. And so, I think of it as in the standpoint of I've seen communities of faith be healing and virtuous, and I've seen communities of faith be divisive and toxic. And it depends on how that faith is lived out. And when I talk about how faith should be lived out in the public square, I go back to Micah 6:8. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly.
Okay. Next question. In your book, you make the statement that Republicans don't embrace Republican policies so much as they despise Democrats and Democratic policies. Democrats don't embrace Democratic policies as much as they vote to defend themselves from Republicans. Do you think the verbs despise versus defend perpetuate the division?
What I was describing was negative partisanship. And I think part of the reason why I wrote it like that is it's bad writing to just go ahead and keep using the same word over and over again. As I make very clear in the book, there is an enormous animosity running on both sides of the spectrum. So both sides of the spectrum have, now that's not to say that any given moment, both sides are equally wrong. Like this, what I'm not saying is sort of, okay, here in 2020, is the left worse than the right? That's what everyone wants me to answer. Is 20 or who's worse? Well, that very question is part of our problem, because we think if I can say, well, I think the right is worse right now, well, then the left doesn't have anything to worry about. And so what's very, very clear is that animosity exists. It's mutual and it's intense. It is. That's just the way it is. I go through tons of social science that says that the animosity is real. It's very intense, and it's very deep. And whether, Democrats could feel better because in one polling window, only 78% of them had deeply hostile views of Republicans, while 82% of Republicans had deeply hostile views of Democrats. I mean, knock yourself out if you're going to take pride in that, but that still is a problem. It's still a problem.
Okay, next question. How, if at all, do you see all of this division to see its effect within the military? And if it's not the case, why not?
Yeah, look, the military is, in some ways, it's a reflection of American society in the sense that, when I served in Iraq, I was with a group that was more diverse than truly diverse. And I'm talking like religiously diverse, racially diverse, ideologically diverse, economically diverse than any group I've ever been around. So we did reflect America, but not really, in the sense that this wasn't a random cross-section of Americans. This was a cross-section of Americans who all chosen to endure this ordeal together. So that meant we had this common connection, this common value that was really quite deep. And also, I think another thing that's happening within the American military is, especially as we're finding that the most fertile ground for recruiting is recruiting from the children of soldiers and Marines, et cetera, is that we're creating a warrior class of Americans. They tend to live in communities distinct from everybody else. They have a particular set of values. Even though there's a lot of big disagreements over politics, and you'll find some extremists here and there in the military, we're creating a separate military culture, and we have a separate military culture. So I don't think let me put it this way. If America is deeply divided, at some point the military will show some of those divisions, but it's way more united than the rest of the country.
Okay, so tomorrow's Veterans Day. Thank you for your service. Today is the Marine Corps birthday. Thank you, Marines. We'll get you some crayons here later today. So the last declared war was World War II, and so many Americans don't even know Congress declares war, not the president. How do you see that in light of almost as if the presidents that have come after FDR have sidestepped the laws?
Yeah, so it is true World War II is the last formally declared war, although we have had congressional authorizations for the use of force, Desert Storm, Iraq War, Afghan War, both after 9/11. But we've gone through multiple military conflicts from beginning to end, to the extent they've ended, without any congressional enactment at all. And this is a symptom of a larger disease. And the larger disease is the decline of the legislature in the legislative branch of government. If you look at the American constitutional structure, all branches can check each other in different ways. But really, the legislature is the strongest branch, or at least intended to be. It can fire the president. It can fire every Supreme Court justice if it wanted. It can override a presidential veto. And the Constitution is clear. Congress has the power to declare war. Once war is declared, then the president is the commander in chief, but Congress has the power to declare war. Increasingly, what we've seen of late is that the president goes ahead and launches war. And then Congress kind of sort of ratifies it by funding it. And what ends up happening, though, is, once the president launches a military conflict, there's no congressman around who wants to be the person who defunds the troops, who prevents funding from getting to men and women in combat. So we have a real problem with a loss of authority of Congress. And it's a bipartisan problem. Increasingly, what happens is, when a Democrat is in charge, the best role that a Democratic legislator has is enact and defend the president and enact his or her agenda. Same when a Republican is in charge. And so what that means is that the branch of the federal government that is closest to the people, the House and the Senate, are the least potent. And that creates alienation. That creates a sense of separation from citizen and government, and it creates a real problem.
Thank you. In the earlier talk, you spoke about decency, and I forgot what the other term was. You put them together.
Civility and decency.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
When did you see Americans losing that, and why has it happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's been happening for a while. It's sort of the kind of thing where the temperature just keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. I think one of the reasons why is that as animosity increases and as our sense of distance from other people increases, the imperative to defeat them grows. The imperative to deny them access to power grows. And so what ends up happening is we begin to abandon persuasion as a political tactic, especially in political campaigns. We begin to adopt mobilization. And mobilization often requires people not to sort of like stand up and extend a hand to the other, but more to stand up and show, I can punch them, I can defeat them, I can hit them twice as hard. And that's one of the reasons why, I grew up a Republican. I'm conservative and independent, but I'm conservative. I'm very familiar with the way in which many millions of Republicans now dislike, even despise John McCain or Mitt Romney for being too nice, for being too decent. I've lived in many, many deep blue areas. I have a lot of friends who are quite progressive, and I'm very familiar with the scorn that is heaped upon sometimes what's called respectability politics. And that the idea is that you have to fight for every inch, and you're not going to hear somebody else. You're going to try to suppress somebody else's speech. You're not going to debate them. You're going to suppress them. You're going to deny them a job. You're going to get them kicked out of the job that they have. And this sort of political warfare that says, not only am I going to disagree with you, I'm going to try to deny you economic opportunity. I'm going to try to deny you any kind of decent reputation. it creates a sense of permanent political and ideological and religious conflict and enormous amounts of animosity, which when you then kind of step in and say, hey, wait a minute, this has to stop, you're seen as weak. Civility is seen as weakness. Decency is seen as weakness. When the opposite is the truth, when the whole culture is saying, burn them down. When your culture is saying, fight them, burn them down, and somebody is standing up for decency and civility, that requires courage. It's not weakness. But as we've gotten more polarized and we've gotten angry at each other, we sort of see kindness as weakness and discourage it and scorn it sometimes. And I think that's just fundamentally destructive.
Thank you. This next question: the ability to compromise can be a virtue, but on the other hand, there are values that we are called upon to uphold steadfastly. How do you distinguish pluralism from valuelessness? Also, will the Vols ever beat the Tide again?
I can answer the last one very easily. Not until Nick Saban retires at the earliest. So that's the first answer. As far as, I think a lot of people misunderstand what pluralism is. And this is where you go back to Federalist number 10. Pluralism is not an abandonment of what you believe in any way, shape, or form. It's a tolerance of what somebody else believes. And so, hey, you can have in a pluralistic society, for example, two competing fundamentalist sects of a religion living in the same town, upholding their values, advancing their values, advocating for their values, but they're not trying to destroy the other institution or the competing institution. And that's one of the things I think that is pluralism is not compromise on what you believe, unless your belief is I have to dominate you. Well, then it stands against that. It rebukes that. But pluralism says, hey, look, we're going to protect your ability to form, so long as you respect the rights of others, you're not denying the fundamental rights of other human beings. We're going to protect your ability to form a government, a city government, a state government, protect your ability to form a church, a civic association that strongly upholds your values, that advances your values into the public square. But we're also going to protect the right of somebody else to do it as well. I like the way, again, I keep going back to this guy who writes pseudonymously as Scott Alexander. He says, pluralism isn't utopianism. Utopianism is kind of totalizing. It's everyone's going to believe X ideology and then everything will be okay. We will live in harmony. Pluralism is just the greatest Civil War avoidance mechanism the mind of man has ever conceived. Because why? Because it lets you live in a culture and in a community that protects your values. When I speak about this back in those days when we could have things called speeches, where there were things called audiences, I would paint a sort of a word picture of this road in Franklin, Tennessee, where I live. And it runs directly north-south between Franklin and the city of Nashville. And running down that road is about every single major denomination of Christianity, Protestant churches, plus a big Catholic church, including there are non-Christian religions on that road. And nobody worries that there's going to be a gang of Presbyterians after the potluck heading over to wipe out the gang of Baptists. Nobody worries about that. But at the same time, nobody's sitting around there going, oh man, those Presbyterians they're wishy-washy. I don't know. And they're Presbyterians in name only. I don't, Pinos. Nobody says that. These are Presbyterians and Baptists who live out their values and have created and formed and live in churches that advance their values right next to another community that does. So that's not the same thing as saying you're valueless. It's saying that other people can also have their values.
What do you think about the use of the Supreme Court to further party agendas?
Against, I mean, but what is a party agenda is often a squirrely concept. Essentially, I believe the judiciary should stick to its knitting. It should do what it was designed to do, which is to interpret the law and not make the law. And so what's the line between those two things? It's often debatable. It often gets fuzzy. I get that, understand that. But by articulating that value, what you do is that you at least cabin the court into its role. It should not be the case that if Congress doesn't pass the law that you like, that you go run to court trying to get that law put in by a judge. Again, these are disputable on the margins. They're sort of, these lines are tough to draw, but from a standpoint of the stability of our constitutional republic, one of the problems with judge-made law is that nobody voted for these guys and they have lifetime tenure. They're the least accountable branch. And they're the reason why they're the least accountable branch is because of the specific role that they have, which is not lawmaking, but judicial interpretation. If you cut them out of their role, the fact that they're so far removed from the people becomes deeply problematic. So essentially, we have an upside down system from what the system was designed. The system was designed for the legislature to be the most powerful branch and the president and judiciary to be much less powerful, except in very limited circumstances. And it's upside down. We have the presidency's most powerful, then the judiciary is next, and then like trailing way back in the caboose is the legislature. And that creates deep frustration in a democracy, because that means that the branch most accountable to the people is the least powerful, and branches least accountable to the people are most powerful.
Okay, thank you. Given all the challenges you've identified, what can I do as an individual to be a better American in such a divided environment?
And then I also have to answer the one above that too, because there's a very important question at the bottom.
Okay.
So there's two things I think that you can do. One's intellectual, one's more relational. So the intellectual thing that you can do is seek out and learn and read the best expression of the opposing side's point of view. I've never come up with a better way to humanize your political opponents than seeking out and reading the best expression of their point of view. One of the problems that we have right now is if I'm a conservative, often the way that I learn about progressive ideas is by reading conservatives who debunk progressives. So, you've all read these kinds of pieces. They'll say, Progressive John says X. Here's why X is wrong. And so I feel like I don't have to read Progressive John because I've just read the debunking. Well, what you need to do is go read John. Or same thing on the left. You'll say, Conservative David is wrong. Here's what Conservative David believes, and here's 1,000 words why he's wrong. Well, go ahead and read me. Just read me. May not mean you agree with me, but I bet you're going to have a better sense of who I am and what values I bring to the table than if all you're reading is the debunking. But that's how we learn now. We learn through the debunking, and it creates a real problem. Then the other one is more simple, but also more difficult. It's live the values you would like to see personified in American politics. If you want more decency in American politics, don't be indecent for the sake of decency. If you want more tolerance, don't be intolerant until everyone's appropriately tolerant. Don't fight fire with fire. Live the way that you would like to see America transformed. It's hard. It's hard, especially when people are sniping and yelling and insulting and threatening. It's difficult. You have a temptation to reply in kind, but absolutely, I think it's critically important to live the values you would like to see personified in our policies and in our polity.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to answer that.
Okay. Yeah. So the next question is, do you think a modern civil war could happen if the relationship between left and right gets worse? And who deserves more credit for the Patriots dynasty, Brady or Bill? Okay. So I'll answer the first one because that's shorter than the second one. Okay. So the first one, I don't believe a modern civil war would happen. I think that what would happen is more like a divorce, more like when Scotland had its independence referendum, or when Quebec has had its independence referenda. And I think that we would, if it ever reached that point, it would be a painful divorce. It would be a messy divorce. I don't think there would be entirely free of violence, but it's hard to see the American military going to war with itself. The American military is too tightly knit. The weapons are way too lethal. The destruction would be beyond our imagining. I feel like if we were ever going to split, it would be more of a divorce. Now, who deserves more credit for the Patriot dynasty, Brady or Bill? I mean, we're kind of running a little bit of an experiment right now, aren't we? Now, I know Brady, and Brady's like old now, but the Brady-led Buccaneers are right now better than the Cam Newton-led and Bill Belichick-led Patriots. And before Brady, it's not like Bill Belichick was the greatest football coach in America. And I'm not saying he's a bad coach by any stretch. I mean, he's got rings. But what I want to see Bill Belichick do is what I've seen Nick Saban do, which is win again and again and again and again without the best quarterback in the world, or in the best quarterback in world history. So that's what I need to see. I need to see Bill Belichick win a Super Bowl ring without Tom Brady before I'm going to see. Now, the problem with, I wish, Tom Brady had left the Patriots 5 years earlier, more in his prime, but I bet you'd see Tom Brady win a Super Bowl ring without Bill Belichick before you'd see Bill Belichick win a Super Bowl ring without Tom Brady, unless Bill Belichick had Patrick Mahomes or an equivalent talent. I don't know, Professor Beckworth, where are you on that critical issue?
My mind is still stuck when the Patriots beat the Rams with a field goal back in 2001, 2002. I grew up in LA. That broke my heart. But no, it's Brady. It's not Bill.
Yeah. No.
Quite a guy.
Yeah.
Quite a player. Okay, so we're going to be wrapping up here in a little bit, but since we're talking kind of fun talk, you are a child of the 80s.
Yes.
Top 2 movies of the 80s, top 2 songs of the 80s.
Oh, okay. Top 2 movies of the 80s. Easy. Empire Strikes Back, Blade Runner. We can't even have a discussion if you're not going to grant that. I mean, those 2 are phenomenal. Now, there are many great 80s movies, but Blade Runner is the best sci-fi movie ever created. Empire Strikes Back is, of course, the best of the Star Wars series. So those are the best 2 movies. Songs. Ooh, boy, that's tough. The 80s were glorious, and I'm not nearly the unquestioned, inarguable music expert that I am the movie expert. So that gets really contentious, but I mean, can I just say an album? I'll just say an album. U2's Joshua Tree.
Okay, you're my favorite person now.
I saw him play live, Rupp Arena, 1987, Lexington, Kentucky. 25,000 people packed in there. It was glorious. And then I saw U2 again live in 2017, 30 years later in Chicago Stadium. It was also glorious. So
beautiful. All right. So thank you very much. Nikki, you're going to bring it home.
All right. And just because you brought your cat, I had to bring mine as well. All right. Jenny, where's your cat?
He runs, but I have a dog.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. French, for joining Bakersfield College today. It's been a pleasure. And once again, thank you to all our servicemen and women for their service to our country. And we appreciate you being here today with us, and look forward to another presentation from our distinguished speakers. Their next one is in January. So talk to you then.
Thank you, Dr. French.
All right. Thank you.